My name is Michael Akey. If you read the blurb, I was the director of the New York State Military Museum for a number of years up in Saratoga Springs. If you haven't been, it's a wonderful place to go. If you're a Civil War buff, they have a terrific website with a lot of information on New Yorkers in the American Civil War. This evening's presentation is something I actually initially did about a decade ago, and I was going through some of the material, and unfortunately, not a lot has changed, as you'll find out. So, tonight's presentation is Father Abraham's Boys. Make sure I push the right button. Excellent. Over the past few decades, images of child soldiers in undeveloped countries carrying automatic weapons have periodically appeared in the media, followed by an accompanying expression of outrage from the civilized world. As of 2023, there's the number. Approximately 250,000 children under 18 served actively in government and rebel forces worldwide. The recruitment and use of children by armed forces or armed groups is a grave violation of child rights and international humanitarian law, according to the UNICEF. "Maybe we'll live, maybe we'll die," was a quote from a young man named Omar, who began fighting at age 14 with an extremist group that actively recruited children in Syria. Both pro and anti-government forces in that country actively used children as combatants. Unfortunately, children make good soldiers. UNICEF, in a State of the World's Children report, noted a number of the advantages of using children as soldiers. One, they're easier than adults to intimidate. Two, they generally do as they're told, which might come as a surprise to most parents. Three, they are less likely than adults to run away. They don't demand salaries, although for many, the salaries they do receive is one of the few sources of income for their families. When schools are closed and families fragmented, there are few influences that can compete with a warrior's life. In a war-stricken country where the social and family fabric has been torn or eliminated, a military unit can become a surrogate family. In World War II, the most notable example of children as soldiers was the German Hitler Youth. In 1940, Hitler Youth, Hitlerjungen, had over 8 million members. By 1943, as German combat casualties grew, the Hitlerjungen was turned into a military service in reserve. In 1943, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjungen was formed. The enlisted cadre came mainly from boys of the Hitler Youth from ages 16 to 18. As the war ground on to its conclusion, Germany conscripted children as young as 10 years old. Hitlerjungen soldiers were often noted for their ferocity and fanaticism. Sadly, children as soldiers are often considered the most expendable. During the Iran and Iraq War, often children were used to they were sent out in waves to clear minefields. We can thank modern technology for making children more effective soldiers. UNICEF reported a child with an assault rifle, a Soviet-made AK-47 or an American M16 is a fearsome match for anyone. These weapons were very simple to use. The AK-47 can be stripped and reassembled by a child of 10. The rifles have also become cheaper and more widely available. Having fewer moving parts, they are extremely durable and have steadily accumulated in war zones. Since their introduction in 1947, around 55 million AK-47s have been sold. In one African country, for example, they cost no more than $6 US. The M16 is just as ubiquitous and has been described by one military historian as the transistor radio of modern warfare. Most people in today's industrial West consider the practice of using children as soldiers as both repugnant and immoral. However, in America's military past, really only a handful of generations ago, children were a notable and acceptance in America's military service. Children from 9 and actually younger to 17 served both in the Union and Confederate Army in the thousands. During the Civil War, U.S. Army regulations regarding minimum age changed during the course of the war. The pre-war 1857 regulations noted minimum age for ranks was 18 with parental consent. 21, you could join on your own. Musicians, you could be 12. The 1863 regulations, the minimum age for recruits became 18, again, musicians 12. And as the war ground on, the 1864 regulations, the minimum age under any circumstances was 16. Two studies of volunteers in the Civil War estimate that between 1 and 1.5% of the soldiers in both services, Union and Confederate, were underage. And here are some of the numbers. 2 to 2.5 million soldiers in the Union Army and Navy, and approximately of those 33,000 were children under 17. Official number for New York State, children under 17, is 3,012. The probable number of children under 17, more than likely, is over 7,500. Joseph Bushong served in the 18th Ohio Infantry for over 3 years before his 18th birthday. Bushong later said his false statement to the recruiting officer was the only lie he ever told in his life. Young Sanford here enlisted as a private in the 193rd Regiment in March of 1865. Excuse me. By 1865, he was promoted to sergeant. One notable ruse for the underage, these are ordinarily honest young boys seeking to join the service, was to write the number 18 on a piece of paper, put it in their shoe or boot, and when the recruiting officer said, "Are you over 18?" they could confidently say, "Yes." The questionable reliability of the official written record is demonstrated in the 2nd New York Heavy Artillery Muster Roll. Delavan Miller, who was a private, enlisted at age 18, according to the record. After the war, Miller wrote in his published memoirs that he was born January 21st, 1849. And those of you who are better at math than I, he was 13 when he became a soldier. There's a rather poor image of, this is Miller's enlistment record, and it shows 18 years of age. And again, a lot of this information, if you're interested in New York soldiers, is available on the New York State Military Museum's website. Here we have Delavan Miller in his 2nd New York Heavy Artillery uniform. The majority of children serving in the Union Army were musicians. Most of these children, often called ponies, were drummers and buglers. This young man's hat is almost as big as he is. He's in a regular Army uniform. This is a contemporary illustration by noted artist Edwin Forbes, titled Morning Lessons. It shows you the young men are out doing their practicing. The Confederate Army also used thousands of children, the number we don't have. There's musician Richard Reinhardt, 120th New York Volunteer Infantry, which was recruited just south of us. These are 2 young drummer boys from Ohio. Note the fairly distinctive hats they were wearing. Here's Henry S. Richardson, age 16, in this 63rd Illinois Infantry. Yeah. Just how youthful their faces are. This image photograph shows a typical Union infantry company on the march. This is an age of lineal warfare. Units fought in organized lines, at least initially. In the age of lineal warfare, drums and bugles, along with flags, were important methods of communicating for unit command and control. Civil War companies and regiments depended heavily on drums and bugles to communicate various aspects of camp life. They kept time when the armies were on march, and they also assisted in maneuvering during battle.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Does that mean the drummer, for example, or bugler, would they be in the field of battle, or would they be behind a little bit?
Normally, they would not be in battle, but we're going to soon tell you where they tended to be.
Okay.
This is a wonderful photograph of Company C, 93rd New York Volunteer Regiment in Virginia. This is in September of 1863. Now, the 93rd was recruited in Washington County. The regiment bled heavily in the wilderness. Now, one thing that I want to impress upon you with this photograph. This is the company in September 1863. Ordinarily, at the beginning, as a regiment stood up, the official strength of an infantry company was 100 men. Now, you can do a quick count there. We're really short of 100 men. There's a lot, and this is before they went into the wilderness, which their casualties even mounted further. I grew up in Western New York, and that was 126 New York. At one point, one of the companies mustered in 7 men. You know, the numbers shrank due to battle casualties, off on other assignments, and often illness. Now, you'll notice that young fellow there. I'll show you the next. He is one of the drummers. You can see the very distinctive jacket he was wearing with the braiding across, which is typical of a musician. And here's the 93rd New York's Drum Corps. The young man on the left was Samuel Scott, age 16. To his right was Newton Peters, age 15. This is a young drummer for the 51st New York. One of the interesting things, this photograph is reversed, and you can tell the number is reversed on his cap. So the image is basically backwards. Here we have a daguerreotype of John A. Hearn, 43rd New York Volunteer Infantry. He enlisted as a musician in August 1861, and by the end of the war, he rose to the rank of first lieutenant, which was a very unusual rise for a fellow that young. It's a wonderful image. Looks like it's in the New York State collection by the label. Here we have an engraving of a young drummer heading off to war. Now, boys enlisted in the military for a variety of reasons. One, it was adventurous. 2, patriotism. Another was the desire to escape the numbing drudgery of farm and factory work. Fleeing abusive families. Another reason for enlisting was to lessen the economic burden of struggling families. And the third and last is generally to be with brothers and fathers.
If I could ask another question.
Yes.
As a parent, I can't imagine allowing my young boy to go off to war. Was there a lot of these kids orphans by any chance?
Don't know. The numbers are really not there. Yeah. We're now dealing, this is the 19th century. The idea of childhood, that is a social construct. For most of Western civilization, by the time you reached 7, you could be away from paternal control and function, so you're in the adult world. And most of these are not middle-class kids. The middle class at that point was much smaller. These are often large families having a hard time trying to feed them. So, you know, little Johnny's got, you know, he goes, he goes. Often it's different sensibilities due to culture and time.
And families were a lot larger back then.
Often they were. Here's a pair of twins with their dad. Generally, as I was mentioning, laboring class children up through the 19th century did not enjoy the extended and protected childhood. These were middle class and upper class luxuries. As I mentioned, throughout most of history in Western civilization, possibly others, at 7 years old, you're often on your own. You were a small adult. This is young Gustav Sherman. Gustav enlisted with his dad in the 40th New York. His enlistment record states that he was 13 when he enlisted. However, he inflated that age by a year. And he had a pretty extraordinary military career by any measure. He served as an aide and bugler to 4 major generals in the Union Army. He survived 10 battles and was awarded the Kearny Cross of Honor. He befriended Tad Lincoln and played with Tad in the White House. Sergeant Sherman mustered out at the end of the war at the ripe old age of 15. Here's a wonderful contemporary drawing by Alfred Waud showing Lincoln in the Review of the Army of the Potomac, and the young lad under the arrow is Gustav Sherman, who's riding behind the president. See? Camp life for children in uniform was often the same repetitious boredom that was experienced by soldiers from time immemorial. Here they are trying to cook a meal. By most accounts, the military was not a wholesome school of life for young lads. Here's a young fellow watching a card game. He quickly evolved into young fellows playing cards. They're no longer passive observers. The boys who did carry weapons drilled with their companies. Those with bugles and drums often spent long hours practicing their instruments. There were a series of very precise calls and routines that they had to learn. Other camp duties included being messengers, acting as officers' orderlies, and occasionally serving as barbers. Some of the younger boys became camp favorites, as seen in this contemporary illustration. But life was still tough. The initial excitement of military life soon wore off. Homesickness was common. William Bircher was 15 when he joined the 2nd Minnesota Infantry. Bircher kept a diary of his military career. His early diary entries expressed excitement in the training with the regiment. As the regiment began to march and fight, young Bircher's tenor dramatically changed. He described marching for days without shoes, wrapping his bleeding feet with strips of cloth, which he tore from his uniform. New Yorker Charles Knott, age 16, complained the only warm food he had during the winter was coffee. Knott wrote, "The pork was frozen, and in the water in the canteens was solid ice, so we had to hold them over the fire when we wanted a drink. Another lad wrote, "Rats are found to be very good food, and every night many were captured and slain." Along with the shared tedium of camp life, accidents and illness did not spare the young. Clarence Mackenzie enrolled as a drummer in the 13th New York State Militia on the eve of the Civil War with his brother. He insisted on joining the regiment when it moved south in April of 1861. While the regiment was in camp at Annapolis, Maryland, and he was preparing for a dress parade, a rifle accidentally went off, and young Clarence Mackenzie was the first soldier killed from New York's Kings County. Disease was a major killer of soldiers during the Civil War, and the young were not spared. Private Thomas Emonson, 15th Wisconsin, died of disease at Stevenson, Alabama, October 1863, after 2 years of service. When the fighting began, some of the children fought alongside their older comrades. Most of the drummers and other young musicians were non-combatants, carrying messages and aiding with the wounded. None, however, were spared the horrors of war. These children grew up very quickly. This is Johnny Clem. He's probably the most famous and most photographed boy soldier of the Civil War. Clem was adopted by the 22nd Michigan Infantry and accompanied them as his drummer. He knew how to pose. At the Battle of Shiloh, where he earned his nickname, Johnny Shiloh, Clem exchanged a shell-smashed drum for a musket, later stating, and rather pragmatically, "I did not like to stand and be shot at without shooting back." Children were often in the thick of battle. Edward Spangler, age 18 at the Battle of Antietam, remembered, quote, "The bullets flew thicker than bees, and the shells exploded with a deafening roar. I thought of home and friends, and I felt that I surely would be killed, and how I didn't want to be." As Spangler began to return fire, the adrenaline and the excitement of battle replaced his fear. Soon, quote, "I hardly noticed the screeching and the exploding shells, the whistling bullets, and the awful carnage around me." When his 18 cartridges had been expended out of his cartridge box, he looked around and found a dead man's cartridge box and took his cartridges. Spangler looked around at the end of the bloodiest day of the American Civil War and found he was one of only 8 men from his company who was unhurt. This is the aftermath at the Battle of Antietam. These are Confederate dead. Just gives you a sense of the rather stark environment that these young fellows had to cope with. This is also Antietam. This is around Dunker Church. In another area of the battle, 16-year-old Private William Egerton fought with the 107th New York Infantry. After the battle, he penned to his younger brother, quote, "The balls flew around my head like hailstones and sounded like a swarm of bees." The young battle-hardened soldier lectured his brother safe at home that he had, quote, no idea what it is like to be a soldier off in a strange country where your comrades are dying off fast and not knowing how soon before your time will come. Drummer Charles Bardeen, 15 after the Battle of Chancellorsville, noted with a veteran's gallows sense of humor that, quote, Baxter and Badger of my company were killed. Glad that they weren't taking us alphabetically. I should have been between them. Unlike Charles Bardeen, an unknown number of children who found themselves in harm's way were wounded and killed. Here's William Lawn, age 10, lost part of his right arm in combat. This is 17-year-old John Brooks of the 57th Pennsylvania Infantry. He suffered a bullet wound to his head, permanently disfiguring him. An exploding artillery shell wounded William Black, 12, in the hand. Some of the physical wounds have been documented. What we don't know is how their mental well-being fared after the war. Some, like Charles King, who enlisted in the 49th Pennsylvania Infantry at age 12, would pay the ultimate price. Drummer King was with his regiment at Antietam when he was mortally wounded during an artillery exchange. King's death illustrates the unforgiving randomness of war. During that battle, his regiment suffered 5 casualties, and the regiment never fired a shot. Many of the youngsters who put their instruments aside during combat helped to carry the wounded off the battlefield, and they assisted surgeons. These children faced the war's aftermath in different areas of carnage. This is reportedly a field hospital in Gettysburg where the surgeon is preparing an amputation. Here's a field hospital at Savage Station, Virginia, during the Peninsula Campaign. It gives you a sense of the almost chaotic conditions the wounded and caregivers lived under. George Ulmer, a 16-year-old Maine drummer, remembered assisting with anesthesia. He wrote, "It was a horrible task at first. My duty was to hold the sponge or cone of ether to the face of the soldier who was being operated on, and to stand there and see the surgeon cut and saw legs and arms as if they were cutting swine or sheep. It's an ordeal I never wish to go through again. At intervals, when the pile became too large, I was obliged to take the legs and arms and place them in a trench nearby for burial." The next slide, if you're particularly squeamish, you may want to look away. This is titled Morning's Work. The human wreckage of unbelievable violence desensitized both men and boys. One youngster reflected he could, quote, "look at a carcass of a man with pretty much the feeling as I would were it a horse or a hog." This is part of a remarkable series of photographs by a surgeon from Troy, New York. Prison camps were also part of the experiences for some of these children. William Smith enlisting at age 15 in the 14th Illinois Infantry, was shocked by the results of man's inhumanity to man when he described fellow prisoners at the notorious Andersonville prisoner of war camp as, quote, a great mass of gaunt, unnatural-looking beings, soot-begrimed and clad in filthy trousers. And here is a wartime photograph of the notorious Andersonville POW camp. This was taken in August of 1864. They're issuing rations, as meager as they would be. As with their older comrades, child soldiers had their share of cowards and heroes. Of the 21 soldiers under age 18 in the 14th Brooklyn, 7 deserted. At the other end of the spectrum, 30 soldiers aged 17 and under were awarded the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor during the Civil War. This is Willie Johnston from neighboring Vermont, who accompanied his father to war and became attached to the 3rd Vermont Infantry at age 11. Willie officially joined the 3rd as a drummer when he reached his 12th birthday. Shortly after his 12th birthday, in the aftermath of the 7 days battles, Willie's soldierly bearing in the retreating Union Army was observed by the Division Commander Major General William F. Smith. 15 months later, at age 13, Willie Johnson became the youngest person to be awarded the Medal of Honor during the Civil War. And also note that Johnson was born in Morristown, New York, so we'll count him as a New Yorker. At least 2 New York youngsters were awarded the Medal of Honor. John Langbein, who enlisted in the 9th New York Infantry at age 15, and William Levy, 16, of the 1st New York Infantry. The common thread of these thousands of boy soldiers was the shared excitement, boredom, and moments of terror that characterized being in the military at war. It was an experience shared amongst themselves and with their adult comrades. The acts of being a soldier, camp life, surviving on the march, engaging in combat, or directly experiencing the immediate results of combat corroded their childhoods. The defining events of Father Abraham's boys were those of their adult comrades in arms. Their world and innocence moved considerably beyond that of the children that stayed at home. In 1989, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child to establish a framework for human rights for children. Part of the convention focused on the issue of child soldiers. In 2002, through the optional protocol of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the majority of the international community defined child soldiers as any child under 18 years of age who is part of any kind of regular or irregular armed force or armed activity in that capacity. In 1989, the United States signed the protocol. However, the United States is the only member of the United Nations that did not ratify the convention. And for a couple of years, we shared that distinction with Somalia, which ratified it in 2015. 150 years after the Civil War, most nations are more reluctant now to send their children to war. But the practice still continues, despite international efforts to make our children soldiers a thing of the past. Any questions? Yes?
Question comes to mind when you're showing the military youngsters with fairly complex musical instruments as far as the drums and things were concerned. Were they things that might have been supplied by the Army? Did they have them themselves? Looks like it'd be fairly costly for a child.
No, they would have been supplied by the service
Could you
branch.
repeat the question so we can...
Oh, okay.
What I asked was, okay, you can repeat it, go ahead.
Basically, did the instruments, did they buy them, or did they bring them, or were they given them in the service and they were given the instruments? Often, I think for the volunteer services, the regiment would have paid for it, but I don't know.
And that would have been true with the bugles as well?
Yes, that's part of your kit.
How would they have had the training, though, if they hadn't had instruments beforehand?
Well, the one slide, you saw them all standing out in the snow, banging away on the drum. That was practice.
Okay.
That's how they learned.
Okay.
Same with buglers. You know, they learned on the job. Yes?
In the North and South, were these children actually conscripted by the government, or they volunteered? How'd they come about themselves?
These were basically volunteers. There was no conscription for the children.
And these parents weren't aware of what the children were doing? Or
Oh,
they just were runaways? Or
no, again, it's a social situation which is fairly common in the 19th century. We have little sense of how that played out, because, as I mentioned, childhood tends to be a social construct. You know, the childhood today was not the childhood a century ago, and the childhood a century ago was less. There was really no sense of childhood. You were an infant, then you're basically an adult. There isn't this adolescence. There was no adolescence. Particularly, a lot of these people are subsistence, and the main goal of the family was to survive. So if you have one less mouth to feed, it's easier to survive. It's difficult for us in the 21st century in an industrialized country to really understand that dynamic.
Well, yes, but when you think about it, people were getting married at 14, 15, 16, having children. You know, it was just a different, and lifespans were shorter.
Right,
So
right.
things happened faster, and if you are a farmer and your child is 7 years old, your kid is out there weeding, planting, composting, doing whatever. You
Right.
weren't just sitting around, you know, like...
No, you had to be,
cartoons.
you had to,
Everybody was working.
absolutely. And you mentioned 14. One of the reasons given that we did not sign the convention was 14-year-olds being married was, the UN did not consider that good, and there are 2 states in the United States where you can marry at 14 under certain circumstances.
So, you know, it was a whole different time.
It was. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm still not clear on enlistment policy. You mentioned 12-year-old for musicians, 18 years old initially, then moved back, and then I was telling you about my great-grandfather.
Yes.
Looking at his enlistment papers now. He enlisted around his 14th birthday, but when I was able to read his enlistment paper, it says age, it says, and literally says around 16. They put around on there. Yeah, he's around 16. So they didn't pay much attention to anything. If you could breathe and walk, you were in.
And again, it also depends on what period during the war we're talking about. They became less concerned about I dotting and T crossing as the war ground on and the butcher's bill kept getting higher.
1963.
Yeah, well, that was tough here. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I've read that because the drummer was signaling the troops, they were often a prime target. Would you agree with that?
A lot of them were not in a combat role once the shooting started. So it's really difficult. There's not a lot of documentation. Yes?
mentioned prisoner of war camps. Did there happen to be any in New York State?
Oh, yeah. Beautiful Elmira, which was, I believe, the death rate was second to Andersonville. However, we won, so, hey.
One question.
Yes?
Loosely related. Was there any incentive for immigrants to enlist beyond what the American would get out of it?
Beyond monetarily, no, but it's a quick way to become part of the culture and get accepted, and also a quick way to have a job.
Just look at the Irish Brigade.
Yes.
I mean, come on. And even if you think about the Revolution, the Hessians, they were getting paid to fight the Patriots, you know, so, I mean, it was a way to get to America, and it was a way to earn a paycheck.
Absolutely. Yes.
A couple of the letters that you quoted were sent home really were, you know, they used the word chaotic. I mean, they were fairly advanced for.
Well, you didn't see the SIC. It was basically phonetic spelling of a number of these.
Okay.
So you know, that was cleaned up for audience consumption.
And then I just have a second question.
Sure.
Were there any girls that enlisted? You know,
There were women who fought. I don't believe there's any evidence for children, but a number of women did go in under disguise. But again, in terms of children, there's just no documentation. Yes,
I have two questions.
number one.
The first one was, I read it was a common practice when Confederate soldiers captured black units, they would just shoot them. Was there any distinction made between children and adults? Probably not.
During actual combat, you don't generally have time to figure it out.
But when they captured them, I guess.
No, I don't think there would have been, there's no evidence that they were treated any differently.
The other question I had was, if you were drafted, if you were living in the North and you were drafted, you could actually hire a replacement.
Yes.
So it sounds like it would be a way for somebody to kind of, you know, exploit their kids by saying, okay, I'll just put you kids up and you can just kind of serve and...
I'm not sure that's been documented, but yeah, it's a plausible theory.
Well, Theodore Roosevelt's father hired a replacement.
Well,
He didn't fight, and he married a Southern belle.
he could afford it.
So that's what I'm saying. So if you had the money, he didn't want to go, but he was drafted, but he paid somebody.
Sure.
Then I was haunted on Theodore Roosevelt. That's why he joined the Rough Riders.
Yes, ma'am. No?
I see that most men had beards or mustaches. Is that true? So that even from a distance you could tell who was a child.
A lot did. I'm not sure. I don't know if anybody has quantified it, whether there's a percentage. But there were enough. There's enough photographic evidence it was mixed. And again, also depends on when on a campaign the photograph is taken. But I don't think there's evidence for that. Any other questions? Well,
Thank you very much.
thank you, and enjoy what's the rest of your lovely evening.